Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Material Matters with me, Grant Gibson. We've been going a while now, but if you haven't heard the show before, then the idea is that in each podcast we meet a maker, designer, artist or architect who is intrinsically linked to a particular material or technique, discovering how their craft shaped their lives and careers. Currently, I find myself in the South London studio of the designer and maker James Shaw. James graduated from the Royal College of Art in 2013 and since then has made a name for himself by working with a material best described as a bit controversial, plastic. James's pieces have been shown in places such as the London Design Museum and the V&A, and his work is held in permanent collections of MoMA and the Vitra Design Museum. James, thank you very much for doing this.
Hi, well, thanks for having me.
That's a pleasure. Can we describe, in this podcast, what we've tried to do is record in people's studios. We're cheating a bit, I'm going to confess, because we're in the kitchen of your workshop. But could we talk a bit about your workshop to set the scene for listeners?
Sure, yeah. Well, my workshop is in a shop unit of a brutalist estate down in South London, which, like many kind of creative studios, is set for demolition. And this shop unit was kind of built in the 70s with all these kind of fantastic dreams for the future, which somehow didn't quite work out. And now we've kind of taken that over and turned it into our studio. And so it's divided into two spaces. We've got a kind of like clean space, technically, although often that's quite messy.
You have computers in the clean space.
But we have computers
Right.
in the clean space. And then the workshop space as well, which is kind of where the exciting things happen.
It's quite intriguing because obviously before I do these things, I kind of do research on people, and all your press clippings seem to start from when you left the Royal College of Art. There's very little before that. So I'd quite like to discover a bit about your background and how you got interested in design in the first place, I guess.
Well, I suppose I did exist before I graduated from the Royal College of Art. But I suppose, and I was in fact working as a designer before that as well. But I think that there was this kind of like transformationary experience of going to the Royal College. So, I come from a family where there aren't many kind of creatives. I mean, it's a family of doctors mostly.
That's interesting.
Yeah, pretty much everyone is a doctor.
Mine, funny
yeah?
enough.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, right. And apart from my sister, who just before I ended up going off to art school, she retrained as a furniture maker. But having said that, I think everyone in my family has got this kind of like creative bent, I suppose. I mean, like me and my dad were always kind of going off to art museums and going to look at interesting bits of architecture and kind of going on these pilgrimages around to look at stuff. But I think there wasn't really anyone who had considered it as a career. But for me, this was kind of, I was always really firm that I didn't want to be a doctor. This was kind of like really clear to me from a very young age. And I think, but because it was kind of coming from this sort of, I guess, professional's background, I kind of always thought, well, I guess I'll be an architect then, because that's kind of what you can do.
Did your parents want you to be a doctor?
I mean, I think they probably would have been quite pleased if I had been, but they were really supportive of whatever I wanted to do, to be honest. I think they would have been happy whatever I did. But yeah, I'm sure in some corner of their minds they would have been quite happy if I'd been a doctor. My brother's a doctor.
Okay.
And I think, that it makes dinner table chit-chat quite good. I'm sure it must be the same in your family.
When my family gets together, we've got cousins, grandparents were doctors, both my parents are doctors. It's like an episode of ER. They just talk in abbreviations the whole time.
Exactly.
It's a bizarre thing. You sit there and just kind of like, okay. And it did mean that I was quite fluent in medical speak. When I went to university, I could, have conversations with medical undergraduates quite fluently, which surprised them no end. Anyway, sorry, we digress.
So I mean, I guess like before I went off to art college, I kind of had this idea that, I was either going to end up being an architect or a painter, because these were kind of like the only two things that I sort of knew about that you could do. And then I went and did my foundation year at Falmouth and just ended up finding myself in the workshop all the time, just kind of making stuff, basically.
Did you have as a kid growing up at school? Had you been playing with materials? Were there tools around the house?
Totally, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that was always what I was doing, was kind of like fiddling around, making things, kind of off in some corner, making something. And yeah, we actually did kind of have a bit of a workshop at the house, I mean, which was mostly belonged to my brother initially, and then I kind of took over a little bit. But he made a pole lathe in the basement, which was kind of amazing. So I guess there was, even though it was a family where that wasn't kind of the main thing, it was always there in the background. And like my grandma, also, she did a lot of pottery, so she made like a huge amount of the pottery that we actually used at home. And my mum did pottery at some point. And my mum also has she's a doctor, but one of her hobbies that she has pursued for a long time now is spinning and kind of working with textiles. So spinning wool from around where she lives. She lives down in Devon, which was where I was brought up. And kind of spinning and then knitting, which is this kind of like hugely laborious act, but kind of very like wonderful experimentation of texture and colours and all this kind of stuff.
You're in Falmouth,
yeah,
and you're spending all your time in the workshop.
Yeah.
What kind of things are you designing and making when you're an undergraduate?
Well, I mean, I think at that point, so I guess one of the first things was I was kind of like, okay, well, so then I'm not going to be a painter, so I guess I'll be a sculptor then, because that's another thing that we've heard of. But then I just had this thing of wanting the things that I made to have a function, I guess, or to have a reason to exist in the world, I couldn't kind of quite deal with making something that just kind of existed in a way for its own sake. This was some kind of internal struggle that was quite hard that I found myself kind of grappling with. So that's why I was kind of then always drawn to making things with this sort of functional element. But then at the same time, I didn't want to be doing kind of purely functional things, because the message behind it, the thinking behind it was always a very, was such a huge part of the reason why I wanted to make this stuff. So I guess, I kind of ended up making these kind of like quasi-functional objects, benches, tableware, kind of chests of drawers and all this kind of thing. And so it wasn't until I was at Falmouth that I discovered this thing called design, and which I literally hadn't kind of heard about as a profession really up until that point. And at that point there was all sorts of, there was the sort of Dutch people were very big at that point. So I guess there was Droog. Yeah. So there was the Droogs, who were kind of like a massive inspiration, I'd say. But then also people like Andrea Zittel, the American artist. So all these people who are kind of working on this hinterland between kind of the objects that we actually use every day and the objects that we want to kind of communicate and explore with as well.
And when you left Falmouth, what happened then?
When I left Falmouth, first of all, I wanted to get out of Cornwall.
Right.
I mean, I loved it. But it was like having been brought up in Devon and then going 2.5 hours further down into the corner. It was like, okay, need to get out of this corner and go and find out what's going on elsewhere. So I went up to, I wanted to go up to London, but I didn't want to go too much into London because it was a bit scary at that point. So I went to Kingston, which even at that stage, seeing buildings with 4 stories tall and things like that seemed extremely metropolitan. So I went to Kingston and did.
So Falmouth was purely foundation.
That was foundation course only.
And then Kingston was where you were in undergrad. Okay.
And then I did undergrad at Kingston in a course called Products and Furniture Design, which I think I also chose because they had a fabulous workshop there. Which I think still now is
they do have good stuff.
Really good on. And also, just this idea of trying to explore design more, I suppose. But that was kind of an interesting one because I went through that course, and I kind of had various wobbles along the way. I think like halfway through, I was just like, what is all this? I kind of literally just didn't really understand what the whole activity that everyone was trying to get on with was. So I ended up kind of having this wobble, and then taking a year out, where I went and worked in a couple of different design studios, and applied to go and study architecture instead.
Where did you work?
So I worked for a studio called Mark Gabbatas.
Oh yeah.
And then I did some work for this entrepreneur lady who was kind of doing a bit of pure product design. And then I also had this amazing experience going to Sri Lanka and working in a toy factory there. Which was really fantastic. It was this wooden toy manufacturer, and I was kind of literally working in the factory, drawing stuff, designing a whole new range of toys for them. And it was just kind of an incredible experience for like a young person to have, because I could literally kind of do a drawing, hand it to the foreman, and then like would go down to the factory shop and kind of work through it with this team of people, and then 2 hours later there'd be a prototype. So over that period of 3 months, we did a range of 40 different toys.
So I mean, it's proper industrial design.
Kind of proper industrial design. Yeah.
Which is not what you do now, obviously.
So I suppose to complete the Kingston story, so then I kind of like came back, didn't do architecture, didn't go to Eindhoven, finished my degree there. And came out kind of wanting to be a proper industrial designer. And that's kind of what I did for the time after that. So I worked in a couple of studios here in London, on CAD, designing stuff for production. And it was fine. It was something, but it wasn't kind of what was grabbing me, I guess.
Oh, you're smiling, Riley.
I'm kind of just remembering those days, like sitting on SolidWorks all day.
Yeah.
And I mean, just that feeling of like sitting on a computer all day and just realizing that is absolutely not what I want to do with my life, which was fantastic actually, because that was really formative to be able to go through that and realise that it wasn't what I wanted.
So then the Royal College?
So then I went to the Royal College, and that was interesting, because I think I kind of hadn't really realised, but in my time at Kingston, I think I'd been kind of quite dogmatised in a way. I mean, maybe that sounds quite harsh. I don't want to be harsh on Kingston in any way, but I think it did have a very particular ideology at the time, which I think I, like a sponge, had just kind of absorbed. And then I had my interview with Tord Buncher and the other tutors at the Royal College at the time.
Who ran the course, design products course. Yeah.
So Tord was running the course at that point. And I kind of basically just like regurgitated all this kind of dogma that I'd taken in. And which was sort of, quite like, design is this and things should be like this sort of thing. And basically this interview panel just tore me to pieces. And they were just like, what are you talking about? That is absolutely, such a restricted view of the world. And so, I came out of that interview thinking, Christ, there's not a chance that I've got in on that, absolutely no way. But then a bit of time later, I got an acceptance letter and I got in, which was, fantastic. At the beginning, it really just kind of blew my mind, because I was just sort of like, what the fuck is this? Like, the first project that we did, I ended up spending entirely up in Epping Forest, and I just kind of went up to the forest and spent 2 weeks kind of like camping around there and like trying to make oil out of beech nuts, and I don't know, just like building little dwellings and being a bit of a caveman, basically. Just with this sort of, what am I doing here? But then at the same time loving it, and then kind of bringing that back and presenting it. And then it was kind of, it was a really interesting experience for someone who's kind of come from this sort of industrial design background to just broaden things up totally into the idea of what an investigation can be.
Well, it's quite interesting because when I started writing about design 20 odd years ago, the Royal College of Art still had a furniture department that was kind of broadly influenced, I'd suggest, still by Gordon Russell, at least in the staff, if not elsewhere. And there was a very definite sense to the students of what they wanted to be, which was largely to produce furniture for largish manufacturers, probably Italian, possibly in rotoplastic. You seem to come from a different generation that was making where overconsumption was a key issue. We had so much stuff, and you seem to be part of a generation that was creating tools so that consumers could decide whether they made anything. Did you have a sense of the space that you were occupying or that you were going to land in while you were at the Royal College?
Well, I mean, maybe only in retrospect, I suppose. I mean, I think it's really interesting what you're saying because I guess it's really true that we can see that path where it was kind of originally designed and we were doing things for industry, and then that kind of faded out. And then I guess you had the kind of like generation above me where there was people like, I guess like Michael Marriott, who were kind of still working within this concept of like industry and production, but were kind of like trying to make their own clever ways around it kind of thing. So he would make his own small batch roto-molded stool as like a kind of ingenious way to sort of access the benefits of this.
I mean, some of that generation came out of kind of a mini recession in the early 90s, and there was no industry. They didn't have much choice but to do their own thing. And
so in a way, I think that there was possibly something kind of similar going on with me and with my generation, because we were kind of, when I came out, it's kind of quite apparent that there's no jobs going with Vitra kind of thing. Like, if you want to do something, you're going to have to do your own thing. And so in terms of where I wanted to land, I mean, I think I was, having kind of worked as an industrial designer within a studio and kind of for bigger companies, I was very clear that I wanted to work independently in a kind of small studio environment rather than kind of within a corporate environment. And I was going to need to do something that would kind of allow me to do that, to prepare me to do that. So that is really where my final project that I had from the Royal College came from. And so that project was to make this collection of tools which would allow me to produce things, basically. So the idea was it's that a new tool, or the tool dictates the outcome. So a new tool allows new outcomes. And then if you can have your own set of tools, then that will allow you to kind of create things that I guess kind of give you new possibilities. And if those tools are kind of somehow have this there's this word expedience, which I think I did inherit that from if not Michael Marriott, then one of my tutors at Kingston who was very good friends with Michael Marriott.
Carl Clerkin.
Well, Carl Clarkin was a tutor, but no, Simon Maidment.
Okay.
Yeah. And so this idea of expedience in making, which was also something that I guess I'd kind of come across a lot, kind of in my own making. I love working with materials like wood, and kind of like traditional materials, but I guess I don't have much patience in a way. It's like 3 weeks of sanding doesn't fill me with joy.
So no SolidWorks and no sanding. These are the rules. Right?
Yeah, coming across very, very negative here.
I mean, can we talk about that final project? Because it's 3 stools, 3 tools.
Yeah.
I mean, it was kind of quite provocative because the tools you produced were all gun-like.
Yeah, totally.
And there's a quote on the Royal College website that I found, which I will read.
Yeah, go.
Which came from you. We have an image of the craftsman or artist as the lone heroic figure striving for originality. I've produced a set of weapons, brackets, guns of course, to become my arsenal. With these I will fight the fight. So you're like the Clint Eastwood. This.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely provocative, and it was definitely tongue-in-cheek, which I hope comes across, because now hearing that again, it sounds a bit cringy to me. But, you know, it was supposed to be this kind of like tongue-in-cheek message. But yeah, I mean, I'd been reading a lot of books about craft and a lot of books about kind of, I guess, yeah, sort of solo practitioners and artists and makers kind of thing. So it was this idea of kind of like staking out territory in a way, but also just this kind of little observation, I suppose, that a lot of the tools that we have do have this kind of gun shape anyway. You know, drills and things like this have all got this kind of like gun form to them. But then it was also because that whole project started with this sort of weird fantasy that I had, kind of being a bit fed up with, well, not fed up with, but knowing that I wanted to get this kind of expedient production and not spend 3 weeks sanding things, but to have this kind of intuitive and instantaneous way of making things. So I was imagining this kind of gun that you can just sort of like squirt stuff out of, or just kind of spray things with, to kind of build these things that you have in your head in a kind of very like, yeah, exciting way.
Which you did. I mean, one was kind of squirting out papier-mâché or paper. Yeah. The other was pewter, I think it went.
That's right.
And the third was plastic.
Yeah.
Which kind of has become a bit of a signature, I guess. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so there was these kind of 3 tools, and I actually kind of really enjoyed each one of them for its own thing. But the papier-mâché one, which that kind of co-sprayed this recycled paper fibre with a kind of glue binder, so they mixed up in the air and then hit whatever you were shooting at as papier-mâché. That was just like horrendously messy. It was fantastic fun, but it was so messy that when I came out of the workshop at the Royal College of Art and went into my own studio, there wasn't a chance that I'd be able to do it there. It just would have not worked at all. And then the pewter squirting device, which was also great fun, but it was just pewter was too expensive essentially for me to be able to access. And then the plastic, on the other hand, I was actually getting given plastic, this waste plastic, for free.
Well, yeah, can we talk about that? Because where does the plastic come from? This is quite important, I think.
Totally. So I get it from a recycling plant in deep East London in Dagenham, and it's the stuff that kind of falls out of their system, essentially. So, you know, they're aiming to become closed loop, and they're taking in whatever kind of old shampoo and milk bottles and hoping to turn them into new shampoo and milk bottles. But it's just a fact that some of it kind of falls out. So it becomes contaminated in some way, or it just becomes unviable for the very specific market that they have for it. So, for example, the stuff that I've got at the moment has been colour contaminated. And I mean, this is a kind of interesting little story that I keep on wheeling out ever since I've had this batch in, which I actually first got from Zoe over at Institute of Making. This stuff, it's got this kind of greenish, bluish colour to it, which is quite deep. And what's happened there is a lot of the polyethylene HDPE, which is what it is, that we have is milk bottles, because we drink a lot of milk in this country. And we mostly drink semi-skimmed milk. And semi-skimmed milk has a green lid to it. And it's just, the factory is trying to separate out all of these green lids, but obviously some of them will inevitably slip in. And what's happened there is a few too many have slipped in, and it's contaminated the whole batch. And the crazy thing that's happening there is we don't have to have green lids on our milk. Like, we could just as easily have a printed label or something. But for some reason at the moment, consumers have decided and the supermarkets have decided that we must have green lids on our milk bottles, which means that thousands and thousands of tons of plastic get wasted every year because this happens.
So if you weren't doing what you do, that plastic, what happens to that contaminated plastic? That becomes landfill, or?
It can become landfill. It can get downcycled. So I mean, yeah, the problem is that, you know, if you're a plant that's working on very tight margins and you're generally working in like thousands of tons as a kind of like minimum order quantity that you'd even start thinking about, if you've got kind of 3 tons of something that's been contaminated, it's very hard to find something to do with that. So yeah, I mean, it can get landfilled, it can get downcycled and used as an aggregate for something, like put into roads and other kind of concrete mixes and that kind of thing. But essentially, probably nothing good is going to happen to it.
But in your hands, it becomes something else entirely.
Yeah, so I mean, for me, it's remarkable because they literally, at the moment, they've been giving me these kind of ton bags, which is just about big enough to fit into a zip fan, I'll have you know. And then that is kind of a huge quantity of material for a sort of small independent maker to be using.
And you create with it these kind of swirls of material, of plastic, that, I mean, it gets compared to squeezing stuff from a toothpaste tube. I mean, I prefer more to think of it as kind of cake decoration, almost like icing or something. It has that similar kind of effect. So how do you do that?
Well, I suppose my intention with the plastic has always been to kind of reveal its plasticity, basically. So, I mean, the thing that's happening is, you know, plastic is considered to be a bad material, you know, both because of the environmental aspects, which, you know, we're all kind of very aware of now, but also, I mean, so I'm going to launch into kind of the reason why I wanted to do plastic in the first place.
Launch, yeah, absolutely.
Which was because of this, it was a kind of perversity, basically. So this was 6 years ago now that I first started kind of investigating plastic. And it was actually because within the kind of circles of making, you have the kind of good materials, which are kind of, in inverted commas, like natural, which is, you know, things like wood, marble, glass, kind of all these kind of materials, and maybe even metal, although why metal's natural, I'm not quite sure why metal's any more natural than plastic. And then plastic is kind of very low down on that scale. It's kind of considered to be a poor material. It's like a kind of imitation of something else. I mean, in fact, you know, plastic is actually kind of a byword for something being negative. If you use that as a description of a person or a thing, then it sounds quite derogatory. So I got interested in investigating this in a kind of perverse way, because I was like, hang on, you know, actually this stuff is surrounding us completely. And, you know, it is actually very useful. It is causing us huge problems, but is there another way that we can kind of look at it? And part of the thing that I got interested in is the fact that it is kind of invisible. You know, generally plastic, when it's a finished material, it'll imitate something else. It'll be made to look like, you know, whatever, wood, or to look like tortoise shell or something like this. But then when it's in packaging, I think until this kind of very recent, maybe post-Attenborough thing that we're having now, packaging was kind of just invisible. It was just this thing that surrounded everything, but you paid zero attention to whatsoever. You just kind of don't even consider it to be a material in the same way that you'd consider wood to be a material. And I guess that was kind of the point, is that you can look at a bit of wood and go like, oh, that's a lovely bit of wood. Look at the nice grain on that kind of thing. But you're not going to pick up a milk bottle and say, oh, that's a lovely bit of polyethylene. No.
Although you do with Bakelite, right?
But you do with Bakelite, yeah.
Which was what paints did in the beginning of the 20th century.
Which is another really interesting story on that kind of path in the development of plastics, from being naturals, you know, things like rubber, which is from trees, up to polyethylene, which is definitely not from, well, is from very, very old trees, but, you know, not from trees in the same way that rubber is. So when I started working with plastic, I wanted to try and explore its materiality, basically, in the same way that people who are engaged with craft and making explore the materiality of ceramic or wood or any of these other kind of typical kind of craft materials, I suppose. And so, when I started using the extruder, the extruding gun, that was what I was aiming to reveal, was the kind of plasticity of the plastic.
How does that gun work?
Okay, so basically it is actually just a kind of small version of the typical industrial machine. So extruders are part of injection molders, which is how most plastics that we use are made, is through injection molding. But generally extruders are these kind of gigantic things that live in huge factories outside of town and cost £5 million. And so this kind of takes the principles of that machine and then scales it right down to something that, the original ones were handheld. Now I'm on my third one and it's getting a bit too heavy, but scales it down to a kind of handheld tool which has those same principles. So it takes in small bits of plastic, and then pushes them through a pipe which has heaters around it, melting them down, and then it comes out as a kind of like sausage or pug of melted plastic.
So when it comes out as this kind of sausage shape, and a lot of your work is in this, it's kind of, I guess, agglomerations of these sausage shapes. I mean, how long do you have to work it before it sets?
Well, it's pretty quick, to be honest. I mean, if you just take one of those sausages out, it'll be hard in kind of about 3 minutes or so.
So you have 3 minutes to sculpt it before you're done?
Well, probably even less than that. I mean, because it changes its kind of surface and its texture. So really you've got to be quite decisive about the way that you put it down. And you've got to kind of get it right the first time, because if you pull it off, it's going to leave all these kind of mozzarella cheese strings going all over the place and mess up the surface texture of it and things.
So when you're creating a product and you create these amazing things, from candlesticks to tables, all sorts of things, do you draw first so you know where do you have a plan of what you're doing, or or do you improvise as and when you're making?
Both. I mean, drawing is a big part of the decision-making process for me. But I mean, I consider this, like working with the plastic in this way, to be kind of like drawing in 3D, really. Or I mean, I actually relate it to painting, because you have to be so decisive about the way that you place these kind of sausages. It becomes like a gesture, and then that piece that you lay down becomes frozen in space and is a kind of like record of that gesture. And then, the kind of balances between the form and the colour of all of that is what's happening. So it's very different from, making a piece of something out of wood. It's a very kind of, intuitive, like gestural way of producing things. You
have talked about spontaneity in manufacturing.
Mm-hmm.
This is what it is. It's spontaneous.
I mean, by its nature, because this way of making things, like I can't ever make two things the same. Like, it's actually not possible. And I really enjoy that. It means that each piece has its own character. Even the kind of the candlesticks, which are some of the smallest things that I make, and are actually kind of a byproduct of making the other things. Each one will kind of be like a little individual sculpture of its own. And it's really interesting to see when people are choosing, if people want to buy one and they're choosing which one, it becomes kind of like a personality test in a way, like which direction they go in that choice.
I'm intrigued. I mean, you call one series, some of your later work, Plastic Baroque.
Yeah.
The use of the word Baroque, I think, is kind of fascinating. Why did you choose Baroque?
That came out kind of quite early. I mean, actually, I think it was there was a table that I made in the first show, the RCA show, and the guy who bought that table, it came from him, because he was like, it's so Baroque, which was something that I hadn't really kind of considered at the start. But then he actually commissioned me to make some wall pieces for his flat, which were based on Baroque sconces. And so it was kind of from that I started investigating Baroque in a kind of visual way. But then in parallel with this, I was also kind of investigating the ideology of Baroque. And for me, that's kind of where the real fascination is, because Baroque as a movement, it can be seen as something that emerged in opposition to Protestantism and the kind of reducing of form kind of within the religious context that was there. But also this idea that Protestantism was kind of about being beyond the world, like being out in in the next plane sort of thing, and rejecting in a way what was going on here on the planet. And I mean, I'm an atheist, so I'm kind of speaking from a kind of non-historical perspective, I suppose. Yeah. That's where my interest in this lies. And Baroque, kind of coming from Catholicism, in contrast, was about embracing the kind of abundance and sensuality and just, this kind of incredible fecundity of what's going on here actually on the ground. And so for me, I kind of related this to our relationship with plastic, because this idea that like plastic as a single-use material that's just to kind of get you to somewhere else is somehow completely denying the actual materiality, the reality of that kind of on the ground here, and is not recognizing the kind of abundance and the sensuousness of the material, which is what I want to bring out in it. So it was this idea that if we can kind of try and get to know what's actually here on the ground with us a bit better, then maybe we can start to form better relationships with this material and stop doing silly things with it, like using it for 5 minutes and then chucking it in the ocean.
Yeah. I mean, talking about that, obviously the Attenborough Blue Planet 2 caused a complete stir. Michael Gove started talking about it. Theresa May gave the first speech Prime Minister's given on the environment for, well, possibly ever, certainly for 2 decades. But people have viewed it, and we live in a social media world. People tend to view things in a very binary way. I've seen your work on Instagram, and people have just gone, all plastic is wrong, without really understanding what's going on. Post Attenborough, have you found that people view your work in a different way?
Well, I mean, I would say that there's been a kind of like, I'd say that my career is kind of like kicked up a lot in the last 2 years.
Right.
And I think it must have a lot to do with this kind of resurgence of interest in it. Because I think at the start, people were kind of like, oh, plastic, okay, interesting. There wasn't this kind of this depth of interest that's going on now. And so I'd say kind of for the first like 3 or 4 years that I was out doing my thing, there really wasn't that much interest in it until this kind of Attenborough moment came along, and I think kind of chimed in with some sort of wave of interest or realization, I suppose, then.
So people understand what you're trying to do, change the perception of the material?
I hope so, but I mean, I think when you release your creations into the world, you can never fully control the way that they're being received. So, I'm happy to accept that people will recognise things on like a variety of levels, and probably, not many people are gonna understand or even be interested in me waffling on about the Baroque movement and see how that relates to tables of all things, But I mean, for me, that basic thing is trying to have a complex dialogue about all this stuff, because I think last year when the Attenborough stuff came out, there was this kind of, as you say, binary shift when everyone was like, oh, we need to get rid of all of this now. And it's like, well, but we can't do that. And, a lot of the people, I'd have conversations with people saying this, and it's like, but what are you talking about? Like, you're wearing a Gore-Tex coat, like, and nylon trousers, we're completely covered in this stuff. And a lot of the things, I mean, maybe we can do without Gore-Tex, maybe we can do without other fabrics, maybe we can do without a lot of things, but there are some things that I'm pretty sure we definitely do need. And so in reality, I think, sadly, it isn't just about getting rid of this stuff, or we can't just get rid of this stuff. It's about increasing our understanding and creating better ways of dealing with it, which do make more sense and are less wasteful. So I guess what I'd like to try and do is, increase the complexity of the dialogue, which I do kind of think is somewhere where, objects that talk about things can help. I think an object that people live with and have in their life for a long period of time is a kind of valuable way to communicate an idea like that.
So plastic isn't the only material you're interested in, though, James. 2 years ago, I think I saw you working you're growing bits of plywood in petri dishes. Can we talk about what you were doing there?
Plastic has been kind of like a big part of what I do, but really I'm interested in kind of the whole material landscape and finding different ways for us to interact with it. And so the bacterial plywood project was, it started off from this project with OpenDesk, who are a CNC plywood making company.
Right.
And they were looking at the future of work. So they wanted us to design some pieces of furniture that would be kind of for the future workspace using this kind of CNC plywood technology, which is great because it allows you to decentralize production. So you can order a piece of furniture but have it shipped from your nearest CNC guy. But I kind of looked at this brief and the future of work and I was like, okay, yeah, that is cool. But actually, maybe plywood is sort of the issue here. And maybe that's actually the bit that I'm really interested in. Because plywood is great. It's one of the most commonly used materials in the world, or sheet materials are, plywood, MDF, chipboard, and they're great things, but we have a basic problem with them, which is that trees are not shaped like 8x4 panels. So whenever you're making one of these sheet materials that we're using everywhere, it's this kind of struggle to turn a tree into a flat rectangular thing. And then the other problem is that trees take minimum 25 years to grow. And generally the ways that we grow them is in these kind of like monoculture forests, which are like killing out diversity. And then every 25 years when you do harvest them, I mean, there's a lot of sustainable practice out there now, but, it can be problematic, the ways that they're harvested. And I'd kind of had this interest in bacteria already going before this project came about. So I just started thinking, like, what if there was a way that we could use bacteria to grow one of these sheet materials? Because the thing about bacteria is that they are very, very small and they multiply very, very quickly, which is actually kind of magic for us in a way, because it means that because of that size and that speed of multiplication, it means that they can do things much faster than big organisms can. So, I'm kind of maybe going a bit backwards around describing this project.
That's fair.
But basically, I started working with this particular type of bacteria, which grows sheets of a sort of cellulose stuff as a byproduct from its own life, and it does this on the surface of a liquid, a nutrient liquid, and then it just grows out to fill the size of whatever container you have.
So you put it in a big tank and you end up with a big sheet.
You put it in an 8x4 container, you end up with an 8x4 sheet. Boom. And then it can do that in about 6 to 8 weeks.
Wow.
Which, if you compare that to 25 years, is pretty amazing.
And then you don't presumably have to end up lugging large bits of plywood around the globe.
Yeah, so that then opens up all sorts of possibilities. Yeah. Like you can actually be growing this, because you can just ship the little spore sample instead of shipping a whole container full of plywood, and then you can grow it close to the point of use for the use kind of thing. And then that nutrient soup that it grows off can all be made from lots of waste products, waste food or other kind of like byproducts that we have as well. So yeah, I mean that's the concept essentially. And I guess I got to it's interesting because it was one of those projects that you kind of start off and you get it to a certain level. And you're like, okay, cool. But now if I want to continue this, I would need a PhD and a couple of million of research funding from someone.
I mean, is this the future role? This is how we wrap up, by the way, James, is the future question at the end. Is this the future role, do you think, of design, to act as a kind of provocateur activist? I
don't know if it's even anything particularly new. I mean, I think people like Droog have been doing this for a long time, you know, acting as the provocateur. And I mean, you could even argue that within that field of industrial design, it's what people have always done, is kind of look to try and suggest new ways of doing things. I mean, look at the Eameses, you know, they were totally on this. I mean, for me, I think I guess, like I said before, I think I probably have quite a short attention span. So it's important for me to be able to jump across different things. And that was always a dream for me, is to have a kind of diverse practice where I'm not just sitting at a computer all day, every day, but also I'm not just up in the workshop all day, every day, where I'm kind of trying to engage all parts of my brain and all parts of my body. And that's why it's really important for me to be able to kind of traverse across, like, making things out of plastic up in the workshop, all the way up to curating and kind of talking about stuff like this.
James Shaw, that was brilliant. Thank you very much.
Great.
And to learn more about James's work, go to jamesmichaelshaw.co.uk. There are images of the interviews as well as little films and other things on my Instagram page, Grant on Design. If you've enjoyed listening and want to see this podcast flourish, then please rate and review on Apple Podcasts and go to my Patreon page and make a pledge. You can find that at patreon.com/Material Matters. You'll be helping to take the message of the importance of materials, skill, craft and design to a whole new audience. And finally, if you want to sponsor an episode or indeed an entire series, do drop me a line on gdgibson@btinternet.com. Thanks very much for listening.